you like to start? Would you like to say something? Would you like to start? I'm just here to... Thank you very much. The 8,362nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The agenda is hereby adopted. I am honored to be here today to chair this meeting of the United Nations Security Council. It is also my privilege to welcome the distinguished heads of state, heads of government, ministers, and other leaders and representatives here with us. Thank you. I also wish to warmly welcome Secretary General Antonio Guterres for joining us. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. The Security Council will now consider Item 2 of the agenda. I will make a statement in my capacity as President of the United States of America. It is a great honor to be here today at this UN Security Council briefing to discuss a matter of urgent importance concerning and countering the proliferation of deadly chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. The nations of the world have long recognized that certain weapons are so dangerous and can inflict so much suffering that all of us have a vital interest in preventing their further development, spread, and use. Since my inauguration, the United States has taken bold action to confront these sinister threats. Many of us are rightly focused on the dangers of nuclear weapons, but we must never forget the risk posed by biological and chemical weapons. The United States was one of the first nations to unilaterally renounce the use of biological weapons. And since World War I, we have led international efforts against the scourge of chemical warfare. Most recently in Syria, we have twice imposed severe consequences on the Assad regime for using chemical weapons against innocent civilians. I want to thank Prime Minister May and President Macron for their country's close partnership in those efforts last April. The Syrian regime's butchery is enabled by Russia and Iran. The Iranian regime exports violence, terror, and turmoil. It illicitly procures sensitive items to advance its ballistic missile program and proliferates these missiles all across the Middle East. The regime is the world's leading sponsor of terror and fuels conflict across the region and far beyond. A regime with this track record must never be allowed to possess a nuclear weapon. For this reason, I announced earlier this year that the United States would withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. This horrible one-sided deal allowed Iran to continue its path towards a bomb and gave the regime a cash lifeline when they needed it the most. They were in big, big trouble. They needed cash. We gave it to them. In the years since the deal was signed, Iran's aggression only increased. The regime used new funds from the deal to support terrorism, build nuclear-capable missiles, and foment chaos. Following America's withdrawal, the United States began reimposing nuclear-related sanctions on Iran. All U.S. nuclear-related sanctions will be in full force by early November. They will be in full force. After that, the United States will pursue additional sanctions, tougher than ever before, to counter the entire range of Iran's malign conduct. Any individual or entity who fails to comply with these sanctions will face severe consequences. I ask all members of the Security Council to work with the United States to ensure the Iranian regime changes its behavior and never acquires a nuclear bomb. With all of this said, I want to thank Iran, Russia, and Syria for, at my very strong urging and request, substantially slowing down their attack on Idlib province and the 3 million people who live there in order to get 35,000 targeted terrorists. Get the terrorists, but I hope the restraint continues. The world is watching. Thank you also to Turkey for helping to negotiate restraint. Anything the USA can do to help resolve this problem in order to save perhaps even hundreds of thousands of lives, maybe more, we are willing and able. We are available to help. In my remarks yesterday to the United Nations General Assembly, I laid out my administration's commitment to building a more just and peaceful future. Regrettably, we found that China has been attempting to interfere in our upcoming 2018 election, coming up in November, against my administration. They do not want me or us to win because I am the first president ever to challenge China on trade. And we are winning on trade. We are winning at every level. We don't want them to meddle or interfere in our upcoming election. As I also mentioned yesterday, we have seen the results of historic efforts to open new pathways to peace on the North Korean Peninsula, and that's something we are extremely proud of. I am pleased to say that North Korea has not conducted a missile test since last November. It has not conducted a nuclear test since last September. And the hostages have been returned to us, and very importantly, the remains of American heroes are now returning home. In June, I held a historic summit with Chairman Kim Jong-un in Singapore, where he reaffirmed his commitment to complete denuclearization. Last week, Chairman Kim reiterated that commitment to President Moon at their third summit and to me in a very strong letter form. I think we will make a deal. But unfortunately, to ensure this progress continues, we must enforce existing UN Security Council resolutions until denuclearization occurs. However, we have detected that some nations are already violating these UN sanctions. This includes illegal ship-to-ship transfers, which must end immediately. The safety of the Korean Peninsula, the region, and the world depends on full compliance with UN Security Council resolutions. Very, very important. But most importantly, I believe that Chairman Kim Jong-un, a man I have gotten to know and like, wants peace and prosperity for North Korea. Many things are happening behind the scenes, away from the media, which nobody knows. But they are happening nevertheless, and they are happening in a very positive way. So I think you will have some very good news coming from North Korea in the coming months and years. I also very much appreciate what President Moon of South Korea had to say about me last night in television interviews. Working with President Moon has been my great honor, and likewise working with President Xi of China and Prime Minister Abe of Japan has been a pleasure and an honor. Each of us follows in the footsteps of countless world leaders, diplomats, and public servants who came here to the United Nations with the same noble goal: to build a future worthy of the patriots, true patriots, who sacrificed their lives for our nation and for our future. To be successful, we need a commitment of every nation represented in this chamber. Acting together, we can replace the horrors of war with the blessings of safety and the beautiful promise of peace. Thank you very much. I now resume my function as President of the Security Council and give the floor to the President of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Cher Donald, mes chers collègues,
Dear Donald, dear
Monsieur le
colleagues,
Secrétaire Général,
Secretary General,
Mesdames, Messieurs les ministres, chers amis,
distinguished
je voudrais
ministers,
tout
dear
d'abord
friends,
remercier
I would like to first of all
la présidence
thank
américaine du Conseil de
the US
sécurité de nous
presidency of the
avoir
Security
réunis
Council.
aujourd'hui
Thank you for having
pour
brought
traiter
us here
de l'importante
today
menace
to
à la paix
discuss
et à la
the
sécurité
serious
internationale que
threats to
constitue
international
en
peace and
effet la
security, which are
prolifération
represented
des
indeed
armes de
by the
destruction massive
proliferation of
et de leurs
weapons
vecteurs.
of mass destruction,
Et
their
remercier le
means of
Secrétaire
delivery.
Général
I'd
pour sa
like to thank the
présence
Secretary
à
General
cet échange.
for being present
La
with
première
us
question
here today.
sur ce
The
sujet qui me
first
vient à l'esprit en
issue
contemplant,
here that comes to my
si nous nous
mind
parlons franchement, nos divisions de l'année écoulée sur des sujets aussi importants que le nucléaire iranien ou l'usage d'armes chimiques par le régime syrien, et tout simplement, que voulons-nous, nous, États membres du Conseil de sécurité, encore faire ensemble? Le régime de non-prolifération qui organise la maîtrise des armements atomiques pour limiter le risque de guerre nucléaire, ou qui impose l'interdiction absolue de certaines armes pour que nos populations soient à jamais protégées de l'horreur de la guerre, des gaz ou des armes bactériologiques, est une construction relativement récente, arrivée à maturité dans les années 1990. Et c'est le fruit des drames du XXe siècle, de la ferme détermination de nos prédécesseurs, de leur vision du bien de l'humanité et de leur esprit de responsabilité. Et cet édifice repose sur des concessions mutuelles, des interdépendances, une confiance réciproque que nous avons bâtie à cette occasion. En un mot, sur une approche multilatérale de la sécurité. Notre responsabilité, je le crois profondément aujourd'hui, ce que nous devons à ceux qui nous ont précédés comme aux populations dont nous avons la charge, c'est de préserver et de renforcer ce régime à un moment où il est profondément mis à l'épreuve. Les États membres du Conseil doivent être exemplaires à cet égard et à mes yeux, sur ce sujet et sans doute encore plus qu'un autre, être unis. Nous l'avons été de façon remarquable sur la question de la Corée du Nord. La dernière fois en décembre 2017 avec la résolution 2397. La gestion de cette crise, le président des États-Unis d'Amérique vient de le rappeler, connaît aujourd'hui une nouvelle étape. Grâce à son initiative de dialoguer directement avec le président du Parti du travail de Corée. Et la France salue et soutient ces efforts, ainsi que ceux menés par la Corée du Sud que vous avez rappelés. À aucun moment, le Conseil de sécurité ne doit perdre de vue que la Corée du Nord continue de représenter une menace nucléaire et balistique pour la région et pour le monde. La France attend du régime de Pyongyang des gestes concrets, démontrant sa volonté réelle de s'engager dans un processus de démantèlement de son programme nucléaire et balistique de façon complète, vérifiable et irréversible. Dans l'attente de ces gestes, le dialogue doit s'accompagner d'une application rigoureuse des sanctions décidées par ce Conseil. Et là, nous sommes unis. Nous l'étions sur la question de l'Iran avec la résolution 2231. Mais c'était en 2015. Depuis, les trajectoires des États signataires du plan d'action global conjoint, dit le JCPOA, ont divergé. Pourtant, je le redis ici, nous conservons tous autour de cette table, j'en suis convaincu, le même objectif. Empêcher l'Iran de se doter de l'arme nucléaire et garantir par un strict contrôle international la finalité pacifique de son programme. Le JCPOA est imparfait, mais il est un pas déterminant dans cette direction. Alors qu'une grave crise de confiance a été ouverte par la réimposition de sanctions extraterritoriales américaines, Téhéran continue de respecter ses obligations nucléaires. Cette situation doit être confortée par un respect de toutes les dispositions du JCPOA et de la résolution qu'il endosse et qui vaut pour tous les membres des Nations Unies, et pas seulement pour la France, l'Allemagne et le Royaume-Uni. Nous devons aussi aller plus loin que le cadre actuel. Et je l'ai déjà dit ici même il y a un an. C'est pourquoi je partage les finalités qui ont été rappelées par le président des États-Unis d'Amérique, même si nous pouvons diverger sur la méthode quant au JCPOA. Je considère pour ma part que nous devons bâtir ensemble une stratégie de long terme pour la gestion de cette crise qui ne peut se réduire à une politique de sanctions et de containment. Les bases d'une nouvelle négociation doivent être posées sur, d'une part, l'encadrement du nucléaire iranien au-delà de 2025-2030, complément indispensable à ce qui avait été obtenu en 2015, sur la question de l'augmentation par l'Iran de la portée et de la précision de son arsenal de missiles, et donc l'encadrement de son activité balistique. Et enfin, troisièmement, sur la stabilité régionale. Ce sont l'ensemble de ces sujets qui peuvent constituer une action utile de la communauté internationale pour réduire les risques de la région et réussir à obtenir la finalité que nous poursuivons tous, que jamais l'Iran ne se dote de l'arme nucléaire. Unis, nous l'étions sur l'élimination des armes chimiques syriennes avec la résolution 2118. Mais c'était en 2013. Depuis, les menaces pour la crédibilité de la norme d'interdiction se sont accumulées. La réapparition des armes chimiques lors des offensives du régime syrien, alors que Damas avait adhéré à la convention d'interdiction et déclaré son programme, n'a pas rencontré la détermination nécessaire de ce Conseil. Daesh a, lui, utilisé ces armes en Syrie et en Irak. En février 2017, en Malaisie, un membre de la famille dirigeante nord-coréenne a été assassiné à l'aide d'un agent neurotoxique puissant, le VX. Et cette année, c'est sur le territoire du Royaume-Uni, et donc de l'Union européenne, qu'un autre agent neurotoxique a été employé, tuant une personne et en blessant 4 autres. La France rappelle ici qu'elle partage l'analyse britannique, selon laquelle il n'y a pas d'autre explication plausible que celle de la responsabilité de la Russie, et appelle cette dernière à prendre toutes les mesures nécessaires pour faire cesser cette menace. La France a lancé le 23 janvier 2018 un partenariat international contre l'impunité de l'utilisation d'armes chimiques, que tous les États sont invités à rejoindre. Elle a dû agir également, et je veux ici remercier le président Trump et la première ministre May, en lien donc avec les États-Unis et le Royaume-Uni, contre les capacités chimiques syriennes. Elle œuvre au renforcement de l'Organisation pour l'interdiction des armes chimiques par la mise en place d'un nouveau mécanisme d'enquête et d'attribution, qui est indispensable. Monsieur le Président, la France travaillera inlassablement à l'unité de ce Conseil sur les questions de non-prolifération. Nous devons rester unis, car ces dernières années, à chaque fois que nous avions brisé l'Union, c'est aux dépens de nos principes et de notre efficacité collective. C'est une condition de notre légitimité en tant que membre permanent et non permanent. Nous devons l'être aussi parce que la dissémination des technologies porte en germe de nouvelles menaces à la paix nous concerne directement. Le développlement de missiles intercontinentaux par la Corée du Nord doit nous interroger. Jusqu'à présent, seuls quelques États disposaient de ces puissants armements, ce qui leur imposait une responsabilité particulière. À l'avenir, si un contrôle suffisant n'est pas assuré par tous, et si la Corée du Nord prolifère, combien de pays en disposeront? Au Moyen-Orient, l'assistance balistique apportée au Hezbollah et aux Houthis constitue un développement nouveau
capabilities is a new and alarming
Elle doit
development.
cesser
It has to
avant que ces
stop
entités ne déstabilisent plus
before
gravement
they
une
further
région sous tension.
destabilize a region which is
La
already
lutte
tense.
contre Daesh
Fighting
a
Daesh
confirmé l'intérêt des groupes
confirmed
terroristes pour
that
les
the
armes de
terrorist groups
destruction
are
massive.
interested in the weapons of
La
mass
menace d'un
destruction.
terrorisme
The
nucléaire
threat of
ou radiologique
nuclear or
n'a pas
radiological
disparu.
terrorism has
En
not
dépit du
disappeared,
leadership dont ont fait
despite the
preuve les
leadership
États-Unis dans ce
that
domaine
has been shown
avec
by
les
the
sommets
United States
sur
here
la sécurité
with
nucléaire.
the summit conducted on nuclear
La
security.
France appelle à la
France
poursuite de la
calls
coopération
that we
internationale
continue
plus que jamais nécessaire.
international cooperation here. It's
Monsieur le Président,
more necessary now than
la
ever.
France continuera
Mr.
de
President,
respecter
we will
strictement ses
continue
engagements
strictly
au
abiding
titre du
by
régime
our
international
commitments
de
under the
non-prolifération
international
et à
non-proliferation
renforcer les
regime and will
différentes
continue
institutions qui en forment
strengthening
l'ossature.
the various institutions
Elle
which form its
continuera en
backbone.
particulier
In particular,
de
we
soutenir
will
les efforts des
continue to
Nations
support
Unies
the efforts
et de ses
made by the
experts
United Nations and
et
its
portera
experts,
les
and
enjeux
will
de la
bring
lutte contre la
the issue
prolifération
of
nucléaire,
combating
chimique,
nuclear, chemical,
biologique et
biological,
balistique
and ballistic
lors de sa présidence du
proliferation
G7 en
during our
2019.
presidency of G7 in
Et j'en appelle
2019.
pour cela
And for
à notre
this,
unité
I
et
call
notre esprit de
for our
responsabilité.
unity and the
Car
spirit
ce
of
régime de
responsibility, because the
non-prolifération
non-proliferation
est la
regime
colonne vertébrale
is the
de
backbone
notre système de sécurité
of
collective.
our system of
Nous l'avons
collective
bâti
security.
décennie après décennie.
We kept building it decade after
Il est
decade.
encore jeune.
It's still
Il
young.
requiert notre
It
mobilisation,
requires our
notre esprit de
mobilization,
responsabilité
our spirit of
et notre
responsibility,
unité.
and our
Je
unity.
vous remercie.
I thank you.
I thank the President of France for his statement. Thank you very much. I now call on the President of Poland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Distinguished Mr. President, distinguished Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, Heads of the States, Prime Ministers, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, the current security situation is not encouraging. Tensions at the global and regional level threaten the existing international order, including non-proliferation and arms control regimes. In fact, we have been witnessing their progressive decomposition. They have been regularly challenged by non-state actors, but what is of even more concern, they are also being undermined by individual states. Before I address the problem of nuclear weapons, I first would like to draw your attention to another type of weapons of mass destruction that made their way back to the top of the global agenda. I'm referring to chemical weapons. Let me be clear. Every use of a chemical weapon is a crime. It does not matter whether it's used on a mass scale by undemocratic regimes against their own people to secure their power, or it's used in a state terrorist manner against individuals abroad on whom a certain state wants to take revenge. And if it is a crime, it means that the principal obligation of the international community is defined by the rule-based order. Criminals must be brought to justice. No single act of use of the chemical weapon can be left unanswered, since it undermines not only the basic sense of justice, but also leads to the erosion of the non-proliferation and disarmament regimes and, in consequence, threatens the security of all of us. Brutal attacks, directed mostly against civilians, all have the same aim: to intimidate the international community. The community of the UN cannot accept such methods. Our inaction will only encourage perpetrators. I hope that the finalization of the new EU sanction mechanism, completed in the framework of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, will allow us to exercise appropriate pressure on current and future perpetrators, as well as deter them from these unacceptable actions. We all hoped to have chemical weapons effectively banned by the Chemical Weapons Convention. We must stand firmly behind our own rules and norms, which are the pillars of the international order. In this context, let me mention that, as in the previous years, Poland will introduce in the United Nations General Assembly a draft resolution on the implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. It is of great importance to preserve the integrity of this regime. Therefore, we call on all member states to ensure a strong, clear and united message of support of the whole international community for the integrity of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the efforts of the Organization for the Prohibition of the Chemical Weapons. The second issue I would like to highlight is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Permit me to make 3 points regarding this matter. Firstly, we all know that nuclear weapons cannot be brought on the free market. Therefore, every act of proliferation of these weapons is a failure of both the international community and the rule-based world order. And we must remember that it always involves not only the state that develops nuclear capacity, but also those who provide it with means to achieve it, namely technology, materials, and resources. It's of utmost importance for every agreement that aims at controlling nuclear programs to guarantee that they are used solely for peaceful purposes. We have an obligation to evaluate those agreements against the purposes and to act accordingly. We should not turn our heads back from those who act against the Non-Proliferation Treaty by providing means to develop nuclear weapon capacity or assist in other ways in developing it. Good and effective export controls mechanism should be upheld by all countries involved in nuclear, chemical, and biological trade for peaceful purposes in order to maintain the appropriate control level of dual-use goods and to make non-proliferation effort more effective. In this regard, we welcome the International Atomic Energy Agency's effort to strictly monitor and verify Iran's commitments. Let me also use this opportunity to commend the vital role the agency plays in the non-proliferation area. The agency's system of safeguards is a fundamental component of the nuclear non-proliferation regime and plays an indispensable role in the implementation of the NPT. Secondly, I would like to welcome the prospect of the process of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We have seen some encouraging developments, such as the inter-Korean summits and the meeting of Kim Jong-un with the President Donald Trump. These led to the stopping of the missile and nuclear tests. And I would like to stress, Mr. President, that this is in tremendous measure your and President Moon's great achievement and merit. So thank you very much. However, the decisive steps are yet to be made. The lasting peace will not be achieved without the denuclearization of the North Korea in a complete, verifiable and irreversible manner. Until then, the international community must remain united in maintaining real and consistent pressure on the North Korea, including by upholding UN sanctions regime. Thirdly, for the credibility of international community, it's vital to stand firmly behind duties and obligations we took in our shoulders. In that context, let me sadly reflect on the concerning developments of security situation in our region, Central and Eastern Europe. Only in the last few years, we have witnessed the clear breach of the Budapest Memorandum that guaranteed territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange of its peaceful and voluntary denuclearization. We have also heard about the use of nuclear weapons to end conventional conflicts. Equally alarming was the deployment of a dual-capable means of delivery close to our borders. All these actions have significantly contributed to the deterioration of the security environment. Ladies and gentlemen, what should be our response to the challenges I have just listed? First, the full and firm implementation of the well-established and widely recognized treaties and norms of the international law. Second, support and full confidence for the work of international mechanisms responsible for preventing of the use of weapons of mass destruction. Finally, proactive and constructive engagement in initiatives which aim at fighting with proliferation efforts and promoting transparency and verification. In 2018, my country assumed the chairmanship of the second preparatory committee for the 2020 review conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and chaired the Hague Code of Conduct against ballistic missile proliferation. Our efforts have been focused on strengthening these regimes, their universalization, securing the widespread and credible verification mechanism, implementation of good practices, as well as tightening the international cooperation. These actions constitute long-term objectives of the Polish security policy. In conclusion, let me stress once again that non-proliferation is a collective effort to uphold the security architecture which we have built for decades and to prevent the nightmares recurring uses of weapons of mass destruction. We need full commitment of all of us, without any exception, to observe all norms and obligations in this field. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I now give the floor to the President of Equatorial Guinea. Please. Thank
you. Gracias.
Thank you,
Presidente,
President,
Excelencias,
Your Excellencies,
señoras y señores.
ladies and gentlemen.
It
is for me a pleasure and an honor to address for the first time in person this forum on behalf of and in representation of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. We thank the United States of America for having convened this open debate this morning, and we congratulate the United States on their excellent work as President of the Council for the month of September. Disarmament is one of the longest-standing goals of the United Nations. Indeed, it was the subject of the very first Security Council resolution on the 25th of January 1946, when the Security Council adopted Resolution 1 of the United Nations Security Council, enshrined in Article 47 of the Charter of the United Nations. 72 years have elapsed since the adoption of the aforementioned resolution by the Security Council. And today, the world is once again caught up in an arms race, which has led many states to feel themselves compelled to acquire a range of weapons of all kinds for their defense, and more specifically has led them feeling compelled to obtain weapons of mass destruction in some instances. Nuclear arsenals do not just serve to exacerbate tensions between states and to hinder the drive for peace, but they also put in jeopardy the very continued existence of humankind. Our country, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, does not possess, nor does it intend ever to acquire weapons of mass destruction, and we have adopted measures to guarantee the strict and full implementation of the commitments and obligations that we bear to the international community in the sphere of non-proliferation. We have ratified the African Treaty for the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in our continent, a treaty that is better known as the Treaty of Ndamba.
debe ser una prioridad
promotion of nuclear
para la
disarmament
agenda de la
ought to
comunidad
be a
internacional.
priority, if not indeed the
Dentro de 2
priority,
años
on the agenda of the
se
international
celebrará
community.
medio siglo
In 2
de la
years,
entrada
we
en
will
vigor
celebrate
del
the 50th
Tratado
anniversary of the
de
entry
no
into force of the
proliferación de armas
Non-Proliferation
nucleares,
Treaty,
y
or
que entró en vigor
NPT,
en
which entered
1970,
into force in
instrumento
1970,
internacional
and which is an
que
international
posibilitó
instrument
prevenir
that made it
la
possible to
proliferación de
halt
armas
the spread
nucleares
and proliferation of
entre los
nuclear
países
weapons to those
que no las
countries
poseen
that, as of that date,
hasta
were
esa
non-nuclear
fecha,
weapons states.
pero que no tuvo el mismo
Sadly,
éxito
the
respecto
NPT did not
a la
succeed
eliminación de
in
parte de
achieving
los
the
estados
elimination
nucleares
by nuclear weapon states
armados
of
de los
their
arsenales
existing
nucleares
arsenals.
mantenidos por ellos, porque
which they still
siempre ha
maintain.
existido una feroz
There
resistencia
has always been
del
a
cumplimiento
deep-rooted
por parte de los
resistance
estados
by
nuclearmente
nuclear weapon
armados
states
en lo que se
to
refiere
complying with
a
the
la
provisions of the
implementación
NPT,
de sus
which
compromisos
apply to
de
the
desarme
implementation
nuclear.
of nuclear disarmament.
Los gastos de las potencias nucleares
The
para mantener ese
costs
arsenal
borne by
y
nuclear
en algunos
powers to
casos
maintain these
modernizarlo
arsenals, and in some instances to
superarán
modernize
el
these
presupuesto del
arsenals,
conjunto de los
far
países de la
outstrip
Unión
the
Africana
budget of all
y de algunas
nations of
otras
the African
regiones.
Union taken together.
Señor
The amount spent on
Presidente,
these nuclear weapons is greater
la
than the budget of
proliferación de
all
las
of our
armas de
nations.
destrucción masiva
President,
constituye una amenaza
the
para la paz
proliferation
y
of
la
weapons
seguridad
of mass destruction
internacionales
poses a threat
y
to international
compromete
peace
al
and
Consejo de
security,
Seguridad
and it
en su rol
undermines the
de
Security
trabajar
Council
para
in
evitar
its role
la difusión
of working to
de la
prevent the
producción
spread and
de tales
production
armas.
of such weapons of mass destruction.
Para contrarrestar
To
la
counter
proliferación
the
y el
proliferation
uso de las armas
and
de
use
destrucción
of
masiva,
weapons of mass
es
destruction,
fundamental
it is vital
la
to
implementación
pursue the
y el
implementation
cumplimiento
of and
de los
compliance
tratados
with
internacionales
those international
para la
treaties
no
related to
proliferación.
non-proliferation,
La resolución
as well as to
1540
ensure implementation
de
and compliance
2004
with Security
del
Council
Consejo de
Resolution
Seguridad,
1540
el
of
apoyo a la
2004.
iniciativa de seguridad
There is also
contra la
need to lend
proliferación,
support to the
el apoyo a
Proliferation
la
Security
iniciativa global
Initiative,
para
to the
combatir el
Global
terrorismo
Initiative to
nuclear.
combat nuclear
La
terrorism.
proliferación
Action is
de
also
cualquier
needed
ensayo
to
de
ban
armas nucleares,
any test of
la
nuclear weapons,
compartición
to share
de informaciones
information
entre los
between
estados
states and
y las organizaciones
international
internacionales,
organizations.
así como aplicar
There is
sistemas
also
de
an
control
urgent and pressing
conjunto
need to
de
implement
verificación,
systems of joint
inspección y
verification,
supervisión de las
inspection, and
armas
oversight
y plantas de
for
investigación de este
arsenals
tipo
and
de
research
armas
facilities
por
of
la
this type
Oficina de
of
las
weapons,
Naciones
and such
Unidas
verification should be
para el
undertaken
desarme,
by the United
en
Nations Office
colaboración
for
con la
Disarmament
Organización
Affairs in
Internacional de
partnership
Energía
with the
Atómica,
International Atomic
lo
Energy
que también
Agency.
debe incluir
And this
su
verification,
seguridad
inspection and
y
oversight work should
destrucción.
include securing such
Además,
weapons and ensuring
se
their
debe
destruction.
impulsar
In
las
addition,
negociaciones con
there is a pressing
los
need to
estados
pursue
portadores de armas
negotiations
nucleares
with nuclear weapon
para lograr
possessor
que
states
rechacen
in order to ensure
de forma
that they
efectiva
rule out
la opción
effectively and
por las
genuinely
armas nucleares,
the option of
a
using
la vez que
nuclear
se
weapons.
garantiza su
Steps
seguridad
must also be
y se
taken to
reconoce
ensure
el
that their
derecho
nuclear
de
arsenals are
todas las
secured
partes
and
al
the rights of
uso
all
pacífico
parties
de la
to make
energía
peaceful use of nuclear
nuclear.
energy must be
Señor
recognized
Presidente,
and upheld.
la República de Guinea Ecuatorial
President, the Republic of
está muy
Equatorial
preocupada
Guinea is
porque
alarmed
las Naciones Unidas
because the
muestra
United
un escenario
Nations
paradójico, lo que
seems
la
to be in a
ONU
paradoxical
declara y lo
situation.
que realmente cada país realiza en
There
el
seems to be
ámbito
a
de su
disconnect
soberanía
between
es una
steps
puesta
taken
en
here
escena
in this House
llena de
and
falsedades,
actions taken
engaños,
by some
hipocresía
states
e
claiming their
insolidaridad.
sovereignty, which is undermining
Hace
what
escasamente
should be
2
an action
días
of partnership and
dedicamos una cumbre
solidarity.
extraordinaria para
Some 2 days
ensalzar
ago,
el pensamiento
we
del
had
líder
an
surafricano
extraordinary
Nelson Mandela,
summit to remember the
donde todos
extraordinary African
apoyamos
leader Nelson
rechazar
Mandela,
todo tipo de
and we all
confrontación
spoke out
y
to reject
rencores,
confrontation
aceptando
and war, to
que
set aside
con su legado
disputes,
se podía
to
lograr
live up to his
un mundo de
legacy,
paz,
and in living up to the legacy of Nelson
seguridad,
Mandela, we express the hope that
desarrollo
we might be able
y
to live in a
bienestar
world
para
of
todos.
peace, security, development,
Pero,
and
sin
well-being
embargo,
for all.
parece que muchos estados
However,
optan
it
por
seems that
desarrollar
many states
una
have
carrera
chosen rather to
armamentística
pursue
que va
the
en contra
path of
de los
arms and
nobles ideales
weapons,
de la
which
cumbre
runs
de Mandela
directly counter to
que
the noble
todos
and lofty
aceptamos
aspirations of
y
the Mandela
aplaudimos.
Summit, a
Las
summit
armas de
which we all
destrucción
welcomed and
masiva
all participated in.
pueden prohibirse,
It
y hacer
is
que
possible
su
to
uso
ban weapons of
sea
mass destruction
impensable.
and to render their
Basta
use
la voluntad
unthinkable.
necesaria
All that is
de
needed
todas
is the
las
necessary
partes.
will and determination of
La
all
República de Guinea
parties.
Ecuatorial
The Republic of Equatorial
manifiesta su
Guinea
firme apoyo
voices its
a seguir
determination
trabajando
to continue
en la
working
negociación
towards
y
the
adopción de
negotiation
instrumentos
and
legales
adoption of
vinculantes
legally
que llevan
binding
el
instruments
desarme nuclear
that
de manera
will
efectiva,
lead to nuclear disarmament in an
y
effective,
verificable,
irreversible
con
and
miras a
verifiable
alcanzar el
way
objetivo
in
de
order
la
to
completa
achieve the
eliminación
objective of the
de todas
complete
las armas
elimination
nucleares.
of all
La
nuclear
comunidad
weapons.
internacional de las
The
naciones
international community
debe
of
igualmente tener
nations
gran
should
preocupación
also be
por las
worried by
consecuencias
the potential
humanitarias
humanitarian
y los efectos
consequences
globales
and the
de
global
cualquier
impact
detonación
of
nuclear,
any accidental
accidental
or intentional
o
nuclear
intencional,
detonation.
y debe cooperar
And the
a
international
nivel
community
de
of
la seguridad
nations should
internacional
cooperate on
para
the level of
evitar
international
que
security
agentes
to
no
prevent
estatales adquieran
non-state
los
actors
medios
from getting their hands on the
practicar
resources
el
necessary for them
terrorismo
to be
nuclear.
able to pursue nuclear
Señor presidente,
terrorism.
la
President,
República de Guinea Ecuatorial
the Republic of Equatorial
apuesta por la
Guinea
utilización
is
de la energía
persuaded
nuclear
of the
solo
usefulness of
para
nuclear
fines
energy for
pacíficos
peaceful
y bajo
purposes
la
and used under the
supervisión
supervision
de
of the
el órgano nuclear.
IAEA.
Concluyo mi intervención
I
de
conclude
que Guinea
this
Ecuatorial
statement delivered on behalf of the
señalando
Republic
que
of Equatorial Guinea
en nuestra
by sharing with you
región
that
de
in
África
our
no
region,
existe
our continent,
ni se han
Africa,
utilizado
there
jamás
are not,
armas
nor
de
have there ever
destrucción
been
masiva.
used weapons of mass
Lo que sí
destruction.
supone para nosotros las armas de destrucción
What
masiva
has caused
son el tráfico ilegal
enormous loss of
de las
life and
armas,
bloodshed
el
in our
terrorismo
continent
y
is
los
the trafficking in
conflictos
weapons,
que
terrorism,
conoce
and the
nuestro
conflicts that
continente.
have racked and
Es
left a
por ello
stain on our
que
continent.
surge la necesidad
For this
de
reason,
apoyar a la Unión
I would
Africana
urgently request
en
you
su
to support the
iniciativa
African Union
y deseo
in
de obtener
its
la
noble
financiación para
objective
las misiones de paz
of
lideradas por África.
financing for
según qué
peacekeeping
casos.
operations led by the
Apelo
African
vivamente a
Union
los
on a
miembros de
case-by-case
este Consejo de
basis. I
Seguridad
appeal directly to the members of the
para que
Security
dicho
Council,
apoyo
asking them to
sea
lend their
materializado,
support for a financing
ya que
mechanism for
al
peace
fin
and
y al
security
cabo
operations led under
contribuiría
mandates of the
a
Security
la paz
Council, given that so
y seguridad
doing would contribute
internacionales,
to international peace and security,
principalmente
which is the
el
principal
objetivo
goal of
de
this
este
august
Consejo de
body,
Seguridad
the
de las
Security
Naciones
Council
Unidas.
of the United
Muchas
Nations.
gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I now give the floor to the President of Bolivia. Thank you.
El presidente de Estados Unidos, el
President of
hermano
the
Antonio
United
Gutiérrez,
States of
secretario general de las
America,
Naciones
my brother
Unidas,
Antonio Guterres, Secretary General
hermanos
of the United
presidentes,
Nations,
hermanos y hermanos
fellow
del
presidents,
Consejo de Seguridad.
brothers and sisters of the
La
Security
presidencia del
Council.
Consejo de Seguridad
The
ha
presidency
convocado
of the
a sus
Security
miembros
Council
a debatir
has convened the
acerca de
members
la
of this
no
body to a discussion
proliferación de
on
armas
the
de destrucción
non-proliferation
masiva.
of weapons of mass destruction.
Bolivia
today.
es parte de esa
Bolivia
región
hails from a
declarada
region which has been duly
libre
declared
de armas nucleares
nuclear
desde hace más
weapon-free
de medio
for
siglo.
more than half a century.
Por ello,
For this
debo
reason,
recordar
I
el
think
artículo
I am in a
número
position
1
to
del
recall
Tratado sobre Prohibición de
Article
Armas
number 1
Nucleares.
of the
Cada Estado
treaty
parte
prohibiting
se
the
compromete
use of
a
nuclear
nunca y
weapons,
bajo
which
ninguna
states that each
circunstancia
state party
desarrollar,
commits to never
ensayar,
and under no
producir,
circumstances
fabricar y
developing,
adquirir
testing,
de cualquier
producing,
otro modo,
manufacturing, acquiring in
poseer
any
o
other way,
almacenar armas
possessing
nucleares
or stockpiling
u otros
nuclear
dispositivos
weapons
nucleares.
or other nuclear devices.
Convoco a todos
I
los
call
estados
upon
alrededor
all
de esta
states
mesa
around
a
this
suscribir,
table to sign up to,
ratificar y
to
poner
ratify, and
en efecto
to
inmediato
immediately implement
estas
this
disposiciones.
provision, and indeed all the provisions.
Esa
of
es la
Section
mejor
2.
manera de evitar
This
la
is the
catastrófica
best way
posibilidad
of
del uso
avoiding
de este
the
tipo de
catastrophic
armas.
possibility of the use of
Es un
weapons of
imperativo
this
ético
nature.
y una deuda
This is a
por
moral
las futuras
imperative and a
generaciones.
duty that we owe
Hermanas
to
y hermanos
future
del mundo.
generations. Brothers
Los
and
Estados
sisters of the
miembros del
world,
sistema de Naciones
the member
Unidas
states
estamos
of the
obligados a
United
cumplir con los
Nations are
postulados
obliged
esenciales
to comply
de la
with the
Carta de
core purposes and principles of the
1945,
Charter of 1945.
sobre todo
Above
el
all,
de resolver
we are
las
obliged
controversias
to
internacionales
abide by the
mediante el
principle of
uso
resolving
de mecanismos
international
de
disputes
solución
through the
pacífica.
use of peaceful
En
settlement
ninguno
mechanisms.
de estos
None
cabe el uso
of
de
these
armas
mechanisms
de ningún tipo.
presupposes the use
Al
of weapons
contrario,
of any
es la
kind. Quite the
negociación,
contrary.
la diplomacia el diálogo
This
y
is
el
a call
arreglo
for
judicial,
negotiation,
los
diplomacy,
que deben
dialogue, and
orientar
legal settlement.
la
And these are the
actuación de
principles that
de
should
los
guide
países.
the actions of
Bolivia
countries
está
whenever
convencido de
faced
que
with a disagreement or
solamente a
dispute.
través de estos
Bolivia
medios
is convinced that only
lograremos
through using these
sociedades
peaceful
más
means
justas
will we be
y
able
con
to build
responsabilidades
fairer
compartidas.
societies and societies willing to shoulder their
Tenemos
shared
que ser
responsibilities.
capaces y
We
dejar
have
en el
to be
pasado
capable of
el
putting behind
primitivo
us and
uso de las
leaving
armas
on the
entre
pages
los
of history
pueblos.
books the primitive
Debo
use of
destacar
weapons to attack other
Como
peoples.
ejemplo, la
I
contribución
would
de la
like
Corte
to
Internacional de
highlight as an
Justicia,
example the
principal órgano
contribution made by the
jurisdiccional
International
del
Court of
sistema de Naciones
Justice,
Unidas,
the primary
en la
judicial
efectiva
body of the United
resolución
Nations
de
system,
disputas entre Estados
which has
en
been able to
diversas
effectively
latitudes
resolve disputes
y
between
por
states in
diferentes
various parts
situaciones.
of the world, and
Hermanas y
states faced with
hermanos,
different
estamos
situations
convencidos
and
de
complaints.
que es
Brothers and
imprescindible
sisters, we are
debatir
convinced
no
that it
solo
is
sobre los
crucial to
efectos,
have a discussion not
sino
just on
sobre
the
todo
effects,
acerca de las causas
but above all
estructurales
on the
de los
structural and
conflictos
root
bélicos,
causes that lead
sobre las
to
verdaderas
war,
motivaciones
and on
de
the
los
genuine and
quebrantamientos
true
de la paz,
motivations
la seguridad
of the assaults on
y la justicia
international peace,
internacional.
security and justice that we are seeing.
Tomemos como ejemplo
Let
Irán,
us take the example of
país al que se
Iran,
ha hecho
a
referencia
country
en la
which
mañana
has
de
been
hoy.
referred to this
En
morning.
1953,
In
Estados Unidos
1953,
financió,
the United
organizó
States
y
financed,
ejecutó un golpe de
planned, and
Estado
implemented
en contra
a
de un
coup
gobierno
d'etat
democráticamente
against
electo,
a democratically
que en
elected
ejercicio
government,
de su
which, in
soberanía,
exercise of its
nacionalizó
legitimate
su petróleo
sovereignty,
de manos de una
nationalized its oil
empresa
production, wresting it from
anglo-estadounidense.
the hands of an Anglo-US company.
Después, por varias
After
décadas,
that, for many decades,
apoyaron un gobierno autoritario
the United
que
States
permitía
supported
que las
an
ganancias del
authoritarian
petróleo
government which
beneficien
allowed
a
the
empresas
profits from oil
transnacionales.
production to line the pockets of transnational companies.
Esa situación se vivió
This
hasta la
situation
revolución
endured
de
until the revolution of
1979.
1979.
Ahora que
And
Irán
now that
ha
Iran
retomado el
has
control de sus
retaken
recursos,
control of its own
es nuevamente
resources,
víctima
it
del
is
asedio
once again the
estadounidense.
victim of a US
Bolivia rechaza
siege.
categóricamente
Bolivia
las acciones
categorically
unilaterales
condemns
impuestas
the unilateral
por el gobierno de
actions
Estados
imposed
Unidos
by the
en contra
government
de
of the
Irán.
United States of America
Asimismo,
against Iran.
condena el hecho de que
Likewise, we
Estados
condemn the
Unidos se
fact that the
haya
United
retirado
States has
del plan de
withdrawn
acción integral
from
conjunto,
the
utilizando
JCPOA,
excusas para
hiding
continuar
behind
con su
pretext
política de
to
injerencia
continue
e
its
intervención
policy
en los
of
asuntos
interference
internos
and
de
meddling
ese
in the
hermano
internal
país.
affairs of this brother
Hermanas y
country, Iran.
hermanos del Consejo de
Brothers and
Seguridad,
sisters of the Security Council,
nos referimos
we
a la
wish to
región
refer
de
to the
Oriente
region
Medio,
of the Middle East,
rica
a
en
region
recursos naturales,
rich in natural
pero
resources,
proporcionalmente
but thus right
afectada
to
por
be,
invasiones,
as it is,
guerras
affected by
y situaciones de
invasion,
agresión
war, and
injustificada
unjustified
que
aggression
siguen produciendo
that
dolor y
continue to
luto
cause
en sus
pain and
pueblos.
suffering for the peoples of the Middle East.
Esta región del mundo ha
This
sido
region of the
escenario
world has been
de
the
los
setting
tres
for the
más
three
grandes
most
agresiones
egregious
cometidas durante
acts of
el siglo
aggression committed
XIX,
during
perdón,
the
siglo XXI.
21st century.
La primera agresión
The
es la
first
ilegal
act of
invasión a
aggression to
Irak,
which I refer is the
basada en una
illegal
mentira
invasion of Iraq,
de que ese
based
país
on the
poseía
lie
armas de
that that
destrucción
country
masiva.
possessed weapons of mass destruction.
Esa invasión
This
produjo más de 1 millón de
invasion led
muertos.
to more than a
La
million
segunda agresión
deaths.
es
The second act of
el
aggression
derrocamiento del
is the
gobierno de Libia,
overthrow of the government of Libya,
con decenas de miles
which
de
led
muertos,
to tens of
con la
thousands of
excusa de
deaths,
razones
whilst
humanitarias.
pretending that it was
Como
for
consecuencia,
humanitarian reasons.
subsiste una
As a
grave
consequence, it has
inestabilidad
triggered
política
serious
y una
political
crisis humanitaria
instability and unleashed
en
a
el norte de
humanitarian
África.
crisis across
La
the north of
tercera
Africa.
agresión
The third
es la
act of
guerra
aggression to which
civil
I refer is
en
the
Siria,
civil war in Syria,
que en los
which,
últimos 8
over the
años
last 8
ha provocado
years,
más de medio
has
millón de
cost the
muertos.
lives of more than 500,000
Esa
people.
guerra es producto directo de la
This war is
injerencia
the
y el
direct
financiamiento de
result
grupos
of the
armados y
interference
organizaciones
and of the
terroristas
financing
enfrentados
of
al
armed
gobierno
groups
sirio.
and terrorist organizations
Hermanas y
who have pitted
hermanos,
themselves against the Syrian government.
En los últimos
Brothers and
meses,
sisters,
Estados
over
Unidos
the
ha
last few months,
demostrado
the
nuevamente
United
su
States has
desprecio al
once
derecho
again
internacional,
demonstrated its contempt for
el
international law,
multilateralismo
for
y los principios
multilateralism, and for
propósitos
the
de la Carta
purposes
de las
and
Naciones
principles of the
Unidas.
Charter of the United
Cada vez
Nations.
que Estados Unidos
Each
invade
time that the
países,
United States
lanza
invades
misiles
nations,
o
launches
financia
missiles,
cambios de régimen,
or finances
lo
regime
hace
change,
acompañado de una
it does
campaña
so behind a
propaganda
campaign
que reitera
which
que
incessantly
es a
repeats the
nombre
message
de la
that it is
justicia,
acting in the
la
cause of
libertad, la
justice,
democracia,
freedom,
los
and
derechos humanos
democracy,
o por
in the
razones
cause of human
humanitarias.
rights or for
Quiero
humanitarian
decirles,
reasons.
a Estados Unidos no
I
le
would
interesa la
like to
democracia.
say to you frankly and openly
Si
here,
así
in
fuera,
no way is
no
the United
habían
States interested in
financiado
upholding
golpes de
democracy.
Estado y apoyado
If
a
such were the
dictadores.
case, it would not have financed coup d'etat
No
and supported
amenazaría con intervenciones militares a gobiernos democráticamente electos, como lo hace contra Venezuela. No le interesan los derechos humanos ni la justicia. Si así fuera, firmarían los convenios internacionales de protección de los derechos humanos o las amenazas a los mecanismos de investigación de la Corte Penal Internacional. No promovería el uso de la tortura. No abandonarían el Consejo de Derechos Humanos y no separarían a niños migrantes de sus familias ni los pondrían en jaulas. A Estados Unidos no le interesa el multilateralismo. Si así fuera, no se habrían alejado del Acuerdo de París o del Pacto Global de Migración. No lanzarían ataques unilaterales, ni decisiones como declarar ilegalmente a Jerusalén como capital de Israel. Ese desprecio al multilateralismo está motivado por su afán, por el control geopolítico y la apropiación de los recursos naturales. Hermanas y hermanos, por encima de estas situaciones, saludamos a los países Francia, Alemania, Reino Unido, China, Rusia, que se mantienen firmes en la defensa del acuerdo nuclear firmado con Irán, a los países que no abandonaron el Acuerdo de París, a los países que defienden los principios de igualdad soberana de los estados, de no injerencia en asuntos internos, de respeto al derecho internacional y de respeto a los compromisos asumidos y de defensa del multilateralismo. La responsabilidad de nuestra generación es entregar un mundo más justo y más seguro a las siguientes generaciones. Eso solamente se conseguirá si es que trabajamos juntos para consolidar un mundo multipolar, con reglas comunes, para respetar y defendiendo todas sus amenazas a las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. I now give the floor to His Excellency from Peru.
Buenos días. Saludo al presidente Donald Trump, asimismo a los dignatarios y altas autoridades presentes. El Perú saluda la convocatoria a esta reunión de alto nivel para centrar la atención del mundo y del Consejo de Seguridad en la necesidad de contrarrestar la proliferación de armas de destrucción masiva y sus sistemas vectores, hoy que conmemoramos el Día Internacional para la Eliminación Total de las Armas Nucleares. A lo largo de su historia, este Consejo se ha mantenido unido en la lucha contra la proliferación de armas nucleares, químicas y biológicas, así como en su sistema de vectores, en cumplimiento de la responsabilidad primordial de mantener la paz y la seguridad internacionales que le confiere la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. La acción de este Consejo se sustenta en el progresivo desarrollo de regímenes internacionales, basados a su vez en una serie de instrumentos vinculantes adoptados por esta organización y sus Estados miembros. El último de dichos instrumentos es la Convención sobre la Prohibición de Armas Nucleares del año 2017, a la que aspiramos puedan un día adherir todos los países y en especial aquellos que cuentan con arsenales nucleares. Ello no es ninguna utopía. Gracias al Tratado de Tlatelolco, América Latina y el Caribe constituyen una región libre de armas nucleares, lo que a su vez le ha permitido avanzar hacia su consolidación como una región de paz. El Perú, en tanto país comprometido con los regímenes de no proliferación, cumple a cabalidad con las obligaciones establecidas por los respectivos instrumentos, así como con lo dispuesto por este Consejo en sus resoluciones relevantes. Y en tanto miembros de este órgano principal, promovemos decididamente su estricta observancia. Consideramos que garantizar la paz y la seguridad internacional implica eliminar el
only be achieved by eliminating the risk that weapons of mass destruction represent. And the best way of achieving that goal is simply by ensuring that there are no weapons of mass destruction. Thus, we wish to make clear our view that non-proliferation should go hand in hand with disarmament and with strict controls over conventional weapons.
Desde nuestra perspectiva,
From our perspective, this entails first and foremost addressing the challenge posed by the nuclear and ballistic programs of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. On this particular point, we wish to once again hail the high-level diplomacy that your administration and you personally, President Trump, have been engaged in with a view to achieving complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We believe that the validity of the nuclear non-proliferation regime should be upheld as well through compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, on the Iranian nuclear program, a plan that was endorsed by this Security Council in Resolution 2231. Additionally, we regret and condemn the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian conflict, as well as in the British city of Salisbury. Against this complex backdrop, and to conclude, President, we wish to underscore the importance of diplomacy, of multilateralism, of international law, of confidence-building measures, and of universality as principles for strengthening the non-proliferation and disarmament regimes. We note that in many instances, it is the perceptions of insecurity that lead to an arms race, and even to the development of new weapons and tactics of war. It is therefore necessary, in our view, to address these perceptions to counter the proliferation and to boost disarmament, investing in cooperation, trade, and international development. Because technology should be wielded in the service of peace and progress rather than for inhumanity and destruction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I'd like to now give the floor to the Vice President of Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, heads of delegations, I would like to first of all thank the U.S. presidency for having convened this high-level discussion on the issue of the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I would like to also welcome your presence here, Your Excellency, the presence of heads of states and governments, eminent personalities, which make this meeting all the more significant, and the topic thereof is of great importance for our world. Mr. President, the rapid development of nuclear and ballistic weapons programs resulted in the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. These weapons feed violence and conflicts. They threaten the stability of entire regions, and thus make the issue of non-proliferation into an issue of survival for humankind. Indeed, despite all of the efforts that have been deployed by the international community in order to achieve a nuclear weapons-free world, nonetheless, we still are under common threat from these weapons as well as biological and chemical weapons. As of today, there are 14,500 nuclear weapons in the world. These weapons bring in the risk of nuclear conflict, which would have irreversible humanitarian and environmental consequences. And this is a real challenge for our organization. We also deplore the trend some states show to invest great amounts in modernizing their nuclear weapons, but putting very little into the elimination of such weapons. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is considered as a cornerstone of the non-proliferation regime, is today being severely tested, and there is a significant divergence of views during the review conferences which take place every 5 years. The non-compliance by some states with their commitments on disarmament and non-proliferation is a serious risk for security and could lead to the non-state actors acquiring weapons of mass destruction. The issue of the Iranian nuclear issue, the situation in the Middle East, in Syria, with allegations of chemical weapons use, the use of ballistic missiles in Yemen, and the issue of the Korean Peninsula nuclearization, real difficult Gordian knots and real sources of concern for international community. These situations are such that they compel us to place the issue of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction amongst our highest priorities. Given this situation, the Security Council, which is to maintain international peace and security, has to continue shouldering responsibility in the area of non-proliferation. In this context, Côte d'Ivoire calls for the implementation of the relevant resolutions of Security Council and the implementation of the various legal instruments, those which are covering the areas of disarmament and non-proliferation. We invite, therefore, member states to discharge, with the support of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, discharge their international obligations which stem from the Convention, which bans the development, manufacturing, stockpiling, the use of chemical weapons and calls for their destruction. In this context, I'd like to say that Côte d'Ivoire is party to all of the treaties and important conventions in the area of non-proliferation, and we incorporated into our national laws all of the commitments which flow from national legal instruments. In the disarmament area, the step-by-step approach did not result in the desired effect, and we therefore call those states which have nuclear weapons to consider a new, more effective approach. Mr. President, we welcome the adoption on the 7th July 2017 of the treaty banning nuclear weapons. They underscore that it's important to implement it rapidly. Outer space, which is considered, and rightly so, as a common good for humankind, warrants our constant attention and requires an urgent adoption of an international, legally binding instrument in order to prevent an arms race in space and make sure it does not become militarized. Further, we underscore the need for the international community to have a more binding instrument in the area of biological and toxin weapons. We also would like to express a wish for a universal and non-discriminatory instrument in order to provide a security guarantee for non-nuclear states. On chemical weapons, we call for a universalization of the Convention of Chemical Weapons and the implementation of resolutions 1540 of 2004 and Resolution 2325 of 2016. In this regard, the mandate conferred on OPCW during the special meeting on the 26th and 27th July in The Hague, the mandate to identify and to bring to justice the perpetrators of chemical weapons attacks could greatly contribute towards settling the issues related to the allegations of chemical weapons use. We call on the Security Council to stand united on this issue. Mr. President, as regards the Iran nuclear issue, my delegation supports the implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is considered to be overall satisfactory. In this regard, we would like to invite the stakeholders to work out their differences over this agreement, which resulted from an extraordinary international compromise and remains to date a certain guarantee for the implementation of the NPT and helps with regional peace and stability. Mr. President, on the situation in the Korean Peninsula, Côte d'Ivoire welcomes the positive developments we have been witnessing recently. The historic meeting on the 12th of June in Singapore between Your Excellency and the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, is a major milestone in this new regional dynamic. We reiterate here our attachment to the principles of peacefully settling the disputes through dialogue and talks, and we urge all of the stakeholders to reject definitively any use of military option, which could lead to terrible and irreversible consequences for the planet. To conclude, we'd like to, in Côte d'Ivoire, reaffirm our attachment to multilateralism, international law, and underscore the need to assign high priority to the preservation of the non-proliferation regime, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, their vectors, and the promotion of disarmament and arms control. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for convening this important debate. There is no greater threat to international peace and security than the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. These issues matter to every man, woman and child around the globe. And the United Kingdom, like the other permanent members of this Council, has a special responsibility to protect the significant gains we have made in the last 70 years. Because the international community has invested huge energy into containing the horrific forces that emerged in the 20th century. The multilateral framework of treaties countering the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is one of the greatest achievements of the international community, demonstrating the value of global cooperation. It has improved all of our security. It has brought a measure of predictability and stability, and it has paved the way to arms control agreements and disarmament. When many of us around this table were born, it was feared dozens of nuclear weapon states might emerge. Instead, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons has seen a remarkable near 30 states abandon their pursuit of nuclear weapons. Global stockpiles have been reduced by close to 80% since their Cold War peak. That is true success on a truly global scale. Similar, if not greater success, has been achieved on chemical and biological weapons. Over 96% of declared stockpiles of chemical weapons have now been destroyed under international verification, and no country professes publicly to possess biological weapons. But the last 18 months have seen these hard-won gains challenged. We have seen chemical weapons used in Syria, Malaysia, and the UK. The conventions governing our nuclear compact are being picked at. Predictability and stability are declining. If we do not increase our collective efforts to preserve and build on what we have, there is a very real risk these gains will subside or fall away. The 1970 Non-Proliferation Treaty is rightly perceived as the flagship of the international community's determination against nuclear proliferation. Supporting it requires leadership. Leadership of the short your administration and you personally, Mr. President, are demonstrating on DPRK, the world's most pressing nuclear threat. In meeting Kim Jong-un, you have created an historic opportunity for complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization. Consensus from this Council to impose sanctions on DPRK has played no small part, but we will not continue meaningful progress towards peace on the Korean Peninsula without sustained pressure. Sanctions must be strictly enforced by all, including the DPRK's neighbours. We must stay vigilant. Ensuring non-proliferation also requires collective leadership, of the type that led to the agreement in 2015 of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. For many years, the scale and nature of Iran's nuclear programme raised serious international concerns. The JCPOA was an important step forward in addressing these. It remains the best means of preventing Iran developing a nuclear weapon, and we are committed to preserving the JCPOA as long as Iran continues to abide by its obligations in full. Iran must ensure they implement their obligations fully, and to monitor Iran's compliance, we strongly support the IAEA using inspections and other monitoring provisions of the JCPOA to their full. Other aspects of Iran's policies, in particular its destabilising regional behaviour and sustained efforts to enhance its ballistic missile capability, continue to cause serious concerns. The international community, and where appropriate the Security Council, need to be ready to address this. And Iran's proliferation of missile and sophisticated military technology to groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, or, as the UN's panel of experts concluded, the Houthis in Yemen, is also not in compliance with Security Council resolutions. It risks a dangerous escalation, so we need to see further decisive action in this Council to tackle both the transit and proliferation of these technologies and increase the costs for those responsible. It is regrettable that Russia continues to prevent the Council from upholding its responsibility to stop this destabilising activity. Mr. President, nowhere are the grim consequences of the erosion of global norms on weapons of mass destruction more apparent than in Syria, where the UN has concluded that Assad's regime has repeatedly used chemical weapons, a direct assault on a near-century-old ban vital to our collective peace and security. Yet Russia has repeatedly wielded its veto to prevent the Security Council from holding the Assad regime to account, even shutting down the international body established to investigate chemical weapons use in Syria. So I welcome the decision of 150 countries in June, the largest gathering in its history, to empower the OPCW to attribute responsibility for chemical weapons attacks in Syria and to put in place arrangements for attribution for any country which requests it. And I would like to thank President Trump and President Macron for their shared determination with the UK to deter the use of chemical weapons in Syria through US, UK and French joint military action in April. These actions sent a clear message to the Assad regime. Perpetrators of chemical weapons use cannot escape identification or act with impunity. The regime's backers must use their influence to ensure chemical weapons are not used again. For there must be no doubt we will respond swiftly and appropriately if they are. The UK saw the consequences of these norms being eroded in Salisbury this year, when Russia recklessly deployed a nerve agent on our streets. The United Kingdom has presented detailed evidence, clearly laid out in charges of attempted murder and the use and possession of a chemical weapon against 2 agents of the Russian state. We have taken appropriate action with our allies, and we will continue to take the necessary steps to ensure our collective security. Russia has only sought to obfuscate through desperate fabrication. Permanent members of the UN Security Council must not attack and undermine the international non-proliferation regimes and the institutions that underpin them. All members of the Council must fulfil their responsibilities to safeguard them in support of international peace and security. It is my sincere hope that Russia will rejoin the international consensus against the use of chemical weapons and the collective effort to uphold it. If so, this Council will again be able to work together to rid the world of chemical weapons. But if not, we should leave no one in any doubt of the international community's determination to uphold international non-proliferation regimes. Not all the challenges faced by the counter-proliferation framework come before this Council, but they are no less urgent. We need to strengthen the rules to keep pace with new technologies and more complex global supply chains. We must help every UN member to develop their capabilities and regulation and ensure they are able to make their contribution to this global effort. The quiet but essential role the United Nations plays must be at the heart of these efforts. So as UN members, we should invest the expertise and diplomatic resources necessary in the conventions. Mr. President, it was collective engagement by states across the globe that produced the counter-proliferation framework. Even the most powerful recognise that investing in collective rules-based restraint was the only effective way of addressing national security interests and avoiding unilateral recourse to force. We cannot let the framework be undermined today by those who reject the values and disregard the rules that have kept us safe. It will take collective engagement to reinforce it in the face of today's challenges, and in this, as has always been the case, the UK will play a leading role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I now give the floor to the Prime Minister of the Netherlands.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this year there have been several occasions when weapons of mass destruction have endangered our security, undermined international stability and caused terrible suffering. So 2018 has made the importance of non-proliferation abundantly clear. I agree with you, Mr. President, that as politicians we are first and foremost responsible to keep our own citizens safe. And I believe that multilateral institutions play a major role where this issue is concerned. As I will say in my address to the General Assembly later today, the Kingdom of the Netherlands has always championed and will continue to champion the rules-based international order and multilateral cooperation, especially on security matters and other issues of shared concern. The multilateral cooperation requires active support from all of us, including and even especially on the issue of weapons of mass destruction. We should acknowledge the significant achievements that have been made in controlling these weapons. For 50 years now, the Non-Proliferation Treaty has kept the number of nuclear weapon possessors under 10. We can only imagine how much conflict, instability and violence this has prevented. So I'm encouraged that the US, Russian and British foreign ministers have underlined their continuing support for and commitment to the NPT on the occasion of its 50th anniversary. We have seen some positive steps on non-proliferation this year in relation to North Korea. The ultimate goal of our joint efforts is to ensure that North Korea abandons its nuclear ballistic missile capabilities and its programs on weapons of mass destruction. It should do this in comprehensive, verifiable and irreversible manner. We welcome the efforts you, Mr. President, are personally making to achieve a nuclear weapon-free Korean peninsula. For we know that this problem can only be resolved peacefully. As chair of the Sanctions Committee, the Netherlands is doing everything it can to ensure that all nations fully implemented sanctions, so as to keep up the pressure on North Korea to comply with its international obligations. The Kingdom of the Netherlands believes that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, endorsed by the Security Council Resolution 2231, remains a good example of how this Council and the international community can work hand in hand for non-proliferation. The International Atomic Energy Agency has concluded in 12 consecutive reports that Iran is abiding by its commitments under the deal. As long as this continues, we will also uphold our commitment to the deal. At the same time, we are concerned about Iran's role in the region, its ballistic missile program, and its human rights record. In particular, Iran's support for Hezbollah and the role Iran plays in Syria and Iraq, and in the development of missiles by the Houthis in Yemen, remain serious concerns for the Netherlands. They need to be addressed. Mr. President, the repeated use of chemical weapons is deeply alarming. It causes terrible human suffering and erodes the established international norm. There should be no impunity for any use of chemical weapons, not for the large-scale attacks in Syria, nor for the individual attacks in Malaysia and the United Kingdom. The same goes for the possible use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime in Italy. All of us, both within and outside this Council, bear a responsibility. Because of the stalemate in this body, we have tasked the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to investigate and identify those responsible for the use of these weapons. We cannot sit back. We have to speak up, take action and firmly support the OPCW so that the perpetrators can be brought to justice. And we need to do this together. Indecisiveness by countries that claim to support the principles of disarmament and non-proliferation could ultimately have disastrous consequences. And with regard to this, the Salisbury attack, we reaffirm our confidence in the UK investigations. We welcome its bringing criminal charges as an important step towards justice. This bolsters our earlier conclusion that it is essential to hold those responsible to account. Mr. President, to conclude, the devastating consequences of the use of weapons of mass destruction underline the urgent need to take action. The use of these weapons must never become the new normal. We must prevent impunity at all costs. A legal norm can only be effective if we collectively uphold it, together, as part of a multilateral effort. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for his statement. I now give the floor to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kuwait. Thank you.
In the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate, Mr. President Donald Trump, at the outset, I would like to express our satisfaction and pleasure at seeing Your Excellency preside over this summit of the Security Council. We appreciate your initiative in convening this open meeting, which confirms that you attach the utmost priority to one of the most serious threats to international peace and security, namely weapons of mass destruction. The discussion we are having in this chamber comes at a delicate stage amidst complex circumstances facing our world today. That is especially so in the Middle East. In addition to the spread of conflicts and terrorism, we are facing the threat of use of weapons of mass destruction. The threat posed by WMDs is no longer hypothetical. We have recently witnessed the launch of ballistic missiles, the testing of nuclear weapons, and the use of chemical weapons in many places around the world. Here, I would like to reiterate Kuwait's constant and principled position on non-proliferation. Kuwait condemns the use of all weapons of mass destruction anywhere, at any time, and by any party. The use of WMDs is a grave violation of international law. The establishment of peace, security, and stability in the world cannot be achieved in the presence of such weapons. We have recently witnessed the horrors of chemical weapon attacks undertaken by state and non-state actors in Syria. Such attacks confirm that the threat of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction has not declined, despite numerous treaties and resolutions criminalizing the use of such weapons. We are following with great concern the possibility of future attacks using weapons of mass destruction, whether in Syria or elsewhere in the world. We emphasize the primary importance of unity within the Security Council in responding to the imminent danger posed by WMDs, thereby ensuring the implementation of relevant international resolutions, particularly Security Council Resolution 1540 of 2004. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is facing unprecedented attacks from ballistic missiles launched by the Houthi militias towards its territories, targeting civilian and religious sites. The State of Kuwait reiterates its strong condemnation and denunciation of the rocket attacks targeting the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in particular and the region in general. We also emphasize the need for the Security Council to take action and shoulder its responsibilities in confronting the threat facing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in order to preserve international peace and security. My delegation is fully prepared to work with you to take further measures to put an end to such attacks, which are undoubtedly linked to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. In the midst of the events the Middle East region is witnessing, the State of Kuwait remains committed to supporting all UN resolutions and welcomed the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2231 of 2015. While the Islamic Republic of Iran continues to implement the provisions of that resolution and published reports by the International Atomic Energy Agency confirms Iran's compliance with its nuclear-related obligations, we note with concern the independent UN reports that indicate Iran's continued support and financing of militias and armed groups in Arab countries. We're particularly concerned about Iran's interference in Yemen, and as the resolution adopted by the League of Arab States on the 11th of September 2018 confirms, Yemeni territories have been transformed into a launch pad for Iranian-made ballistic missiles, targeting Yemen's neighbors and threatening maritime navigation in the Strait of Bab el-Mandab and the Red Sea, which not only negatively impacts the security and stability of Yemen and the region, but also constitutes a violation of Security Council Resolution 2216 of 2015. The League of Arab States resolution also calls on Iran to cease those acts and all such acts which adversely affect the security and best interests of states in the region, and undertake confidence-building measures with neighbors in the region in order to establish ties based on good neighborliness, cooperation, mutual respect, and non-interference in the internal affairs of states. Mr. President, Excellencies, as I address you from this forum, I consider it a great honor to speak as a representative of the Arab states in the Security Council, conveying the concerns and preoccupations of our peace-loving peoples and their aspirations to security and stability. In this context, the state of Kuwait and all other Arab states reaffirm their absolute faith in multilateral action under the umbrella of the United Nations, according to the objectives, principles and commitments agreed upon in the Charter. We also emphasize the Arab position on the importance of achieving the universality of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was extended indefinitely after the review conference adopted in 1995. It is important to implement the decision to establish a zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And we reiterate here the Arab position calling upon the three sponsors of the 1995 Middle East resolution to shoulder their responsibilities by implementing that resolution, as it is an integral part of the indefinite extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We also emphasize the need for Israel to accede to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to place all its nuclear facilities under the supervision and monitoring of the International Atomic Energy Agency, especially as it is the only country in the Middle East that has not yet acceded to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Mr. President, in conclusion, the commitment you have shown to confront the challenges posed by weapons of mass destruction is not limited to our meeting here today. It is also to be seen in the current diplomatic efforts to ease tension and achieve denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Those efforts made by you, Mr. President, came within the context of cohesion and unity of Security Council members to counter the illegal programs and activities of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We know that to achieve denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, the road ahead is still long and hard. Yet we believe that the absolute and sincere commitment of all concerned parties, as well as the full implementation of all relevant Security Council resolutions, will lead to a lasting and comprehensive peace agreement in a Korean peninsula free of nuclear weapons. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Minister for his statement. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of China.
Mr. President, maintaining global peace and security is the primary responsibility of the Security Council entrusted by the UN Charter and a shared responsibility of all Security Council members. Given the complex challenges to international peace and security, how should the Security Council fulfill this mission and play its role? This is a question that deserves serious consideration. China believes the following. The Security Council should perform its function in a fair and just manner as mandated by the Charter. The Security Council must uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the universally recognized international law and norms governing international relations. It should safeguard the authority and role of UN in international affairs and sovereignty, independence, and legitimate rights and interests of all countries. The Security Council should stick to political settlement as the basic direction. The Security Council should be the strongest advocate for resolving differences and disputes through dialogue and consultation. It should effectively use all tools, including good offices, mediation, peacekeeping, and peace building. Step up preventative diplomacy to serve the larger goal of political settlement. The Security Council should enhance unity to promote consensus. All members must bear firmly in mind their responsibility for world peace and security, enhance unity and coordination, set aside geopolitical considerations, and ensure effective functioning of the Council and uphold the common interests of all UN members. The Security Council should strengthen overall planning and coordination to forge synergy. It should coordinate and cooperate with the General Assembly, ECOSOC, the Secretary General, and the UN Development System so that the political pillar and development pillar can support each other and efforts for lasting peace and for sustainable development can be mutually reinforcing. Mr. President, the proliferation of WMD and their means of delivery poses a real threat to global peace and security and is a challenge that we all face. China proposes that we step up efforts in the following three aspects. First, we need to champion the rule of law to consolidate and improve the international non-proliferation regime. The NPT, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the UN SCR 1540 and other Security Council resolutions constitute the legal foundation of the international non-proliferation regime. All of us should earnestly safeguard the universality, effectiveness, and authority of the non-proliferation regime, and in particular prevent terrorists and other non-state actors from getting hold of WMD materials and technologies. Second, we need to take multi-pronged measures to implement the Non-Proliferation Treaty in a balanced manner. Every country must honor its word, shoulder its responsibilities, and fulfill international obligations. The Non-Proliferation Treaty and agreements must be implemented in their entirety. No double standards, discriminatory arrangements, or selective enforcement should be allowed. Third, we need to bolster international cooperation and enhance all countries' non-proliferation capability. Government bears the primary responsibility of non-proliferation. Countries should be supported in developing their non-proliferation policies in line with national conditions and be encouraged to enhance non-proliferation law enforcement capacity building, carry out more exchanges and practical cooperation so that together we could shore up the shortest plank in a barrel and achieve universal security. Mr. President, the JCPOA on the Iranian nuclear issue is a hard-won achievement of multilateralism, conducive to international nuclear non-proliferation regime and peace and stability in the Middle East. There is no international agreement that is perfect. The JCPOA has been endorsed unanimously by the Security Council. What happened in the past 3 years shows that JCPOA is a viable agreement. China encourages Iran to continue to fulfill all commitments it has made. At the same time, the legitimate right of all countries to normal economic relations and trade with Iran should be respected. China calls on the relevant parties to bear in mind the big picture, think long-term, and uphold the sanctity, integrity, and efficacy of the JCPOA. Since the beginning of this year, the situation on the Korean Peninsula has shown major progress. China welcomes that, and China has made unremitting efforts for this to happen. China supports the important common understandings reached between the DPRK and U.S. leaders at the Singapore summit, support DPRK and ROK in improving their relations. We call upon all parties to seize the current opportunities, turn the political consensus into concrete actions, and work in the direction of setting up a peace mechanism on the peninsula and the denuclearization on the peninsula to realize lasting peace on the peninsula at an early date. Mr. President, China lives by its commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, to upholding the UN-centered contemporary international system, and has earnestly fulfilled its international responsibilities and obligations. We need to work together to uphold the efforts to realize peace and security for all. Before I conclude, I need to point out that China has all along followed the principle of non-interference in other countries' domestic affairs. This is a tradition of Chinese foreign policy. Our observance of this principle has received acclaim from the international community. We did not and will not interfere in any country's domestic affairs. We refuse to accept any unwarranted accusations against China, and we call upon other countries to also observe the purposes of the UN Charter and not to interfere in other countries' internal affairs. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for his statement. Thank you. I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russia Federation.
Thank you very much, distinguished President. Distinguished colleagues, in the world today, effectively combating the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is particularly important for maintaining global and regional stability, for ensuring that we reliably provide for the security of all states without exception. And constructive interaction here is an important element in order to create a positive international agenda. I think that everyone will agree that the Security Council resolution providing for specific measures against those who violate the non-proliferation regime, that this resolution has to be strictly abided by. The cornerstone here is a basic resolution 1540. It contains the obligations of member states to undertake specific measures in order to prevent situations where weapons of mass destruction as components end up in the hands of non-state entities. Of particular importance are also other Security Council decisions pursuant to resolutions providing for sanctions for any kind of transfer of weapons to terrorists. There are facts of such transfers having taken place, and they need to be closely investigated. As was the case 50 years ago when the NPT was opened for signature, so is today our country is committed to the goal of ridding the world of nuclear threat. But at the same time, we need to absolutely take into account all of the factors impacting strategic stability. And in the course of negotiations, all countries now participate, all countries which have the nuclear weapons potential. The desire of countries to ban nuclear weapons separately from the basic principles of NPT cannot be successful and will only create ambiguity in our future approaches to weapons of mass destruction, non-proliferation. Since we're talking about NPT, I'd like to mention Resolution 2231, which was approved by the Security Council and which is a joint comprehensive plan of action on the Iran nuclear program. The unilateral withdrawal of the United States from this creates a serious threat for the non-proliferation regime, all the more so since, as this was underscored by many, Tehran is strictly abiding by its commitments within JCPOA, and this is something that the IAEA is regularly confirming. Russia is convinced that we need to keep JCPOA, and this is something that we're actively working on together with Iran, China, and the EU. Otherwise, if we don't do that, we can end up with a situation where there is more tension in the Middle East, and this could lead to risks for national stability and for the non-proliferation regime. The dismantlement of JCPOA would also be counterproductive also for the efforts underway now to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. These efforts is something that we welcome and support. There are also serious obstacles to nuclear non-proliferation, and I am referring to the decision made by the United States to postpone for a long time, perhaps forever, the ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the absence of progress in implementing the NPT decision to create a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. There is also an alarming situation we're witnessing in the area of chemical disarmament. And this has to do first and foremost with what was done by certain Western countries, which keep leveling new unfounded accusations against them, accusing them of using the Syrian authorities ban substances. And we warn against strikes against the Syrian Arab Republic using a staged pretext. If this were to happen, this would be a gross violation of the Charter and would undermine efforts to foster the political settlement in that country. The government of Syria destroyed all of their chemical arsenal in line with the Russia-US agreement of 2013, and this agreement is enshrined in a Security Council resolution and also in a decision passed by OPCW. But on the other hand, the terrorist groups are entities which have chemical warfare agents. They learned how to synthesize the proposals contained therein are on the table. At the same time, there is a deterioration of the situation in OPCW. There, our Western colleagues are trying to impose on its technical secretariat the so-called attribution functions, which is a gross violation of the Convention and an infringement on the prerogatives of the Security Council. At the same time, what we're witnessing is an increase in unsubstantiated, highly likely style rhetoric about the Salisbury affair. At the same time, the UK is stubbornly avoiding the joint investigation that we've offered several times, despite the fact that this is part of her commitments in line with the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations of 1963, Bilateral Consular Convention of 1965, and the European Convention on Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Cases of 1959. The question arises, if they do not want to cooperate, well, does this mean that they have something to hide? We call upon London once again to start a constructive dialogue in order to get to the truth. The way things are developing gives us reason to think that nothing can be excluded today, including a provocation involving biological weapons. Given the attempts I just mentioned to manipulate the status of the Chemical Weapons Convention, I'd like to warn against the temptation of using the Convention on Biological and Toxin Weapons for the same end. Let me recall, in line with the Convention, the right to initiate and is the right that only belongs with the Security Council. There are no substitutes here. On more than one occasion, we proposed that we agree the mechanism for verification on the Biological Weapons Conventions with all participants. But the United States blocked this, and ultimately this was completely buried. Such a desire by Washington to have their hands completely free is shown when the regime of the Convention on Biological and Toxin Weapons is undergoing another test, and this has to do with growing military, medical, and biological activity, including in the post-Soviet areas. We call on all not to militarize healthcare. We have consistently called for strengthening the Convention of Biological Toxin Weapons, and we are implementing a number of initiatives here, including creating a number of units to counter epidemics and quickly react to emergency biological situations. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, the dialogue between Russia and the United States as the two largest nuclear powers is of special importance in order to strengthen the WMD non-proliferation regime. Our two states were at the inception of creating the general framework for multilateral cooperation in order to counter the weapons of mass destruction ending in the hands of non-stated entities and countering the acts of nuclear terrorism. We continue thinking that this interaction is of principal importance, not just for Moscow and Washington, but for the entire international community. Let us not sacrifice this on the altar of calculations of the moment of momentary situations. On the basis of the UN Charter, Russia is always ready to work openly with nuclear five states, all other countries, in order to strengthen global strategic stability. And we expect that a step in this direction will be made today at this meeting of the Security Council, which is a key body to maintain international peace and security. And we think that in this regard, the initiative undertaken by President Trump to convene this meeting is very, very timely. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for his statement. Thank you. I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia.
Mr. President, heads of states and governments, ministers, we thank the U.S. Presidency for convening this important high-level briefing on non-proliferation, We are very pleased to see you, Mr. President, presiding over this important meeting. Indeed, non-proliferation has been high on the agenda of this Council. It is therefore timely and relevant that we are discussing this issue at the highest level. Mr. President, a few days ago, the world paid a tribute to the late final UN speech in 2006. He said, and I quote, "Can there be any threat more alarming in today's world than that of a nuclear or biological weapon failing in the hands of terrorists or being used by a state as a result of some terrible misunderstanding or miscalculation? The more states have such weapons, the greater the risk, and the more those states that already have them increase their arsenals or insist that such weapons are essential to their national security. The more other states feel that they too must have them for their security." This is indeed the reality that we are facing today. Indeed, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is posing grave threats to global peace and security. From the DPRK and the Iranian nuclear issues to chemical attack in Syria and Salisbury incident in the UK. Proliferation risks have become one of the most serious challenges of our time. The international non-proliferation regime is under serious challenge, and global anxieties about nuclear weapons are at the highest level since the end of the World War. As Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "We believe it is absolutely vital that we comprehensively address risk of proliferation. There is no other option but to strive to find a negotiated solution to some of the most difficult issues that we are facing at the moment through political and diplomatic means." We have all been observing the developments following the recent summit meeting between you, Your Excellency President, and Mr. Kim Jong-un, whose outcome had given us some sense of hope for the progress towards the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the advancement of peace in the Northeast Asia. We encourage such endeavors, Mr. President, as we have a first-hand experience solving and bringing peace for the no war, no peace situation that existed for more than 20 years between Ethiopia and Eritrea through diplomatic means. Mr. President, we earnestly hope that you will maintain the momentum generated recently with the view to finding a comprehensive, peaceful, and diplomatic political solution to the DPRK issue in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions. This Council needs to continue supporting such endeavors. In this regard, the talk about a follow-up summit is indeed encouraging. We also welcome the outcome of the third Inter-Korean Summit in Pyongyang, and we hope this will lay the foundation for the concrete action towards sustainable peace, security, and complete and verifiable denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula in accordance with relevant Security Council resolutions. This Council needs to support the relevant parties to make progress in this direction. In this meantime, we believe the implementation of the sanctions regime continues to be very critical. With regard to Iranian nuclear issue, we remain convinced that the JCPOA represents a significant achievement for multilateralism. We, however, understand the challenges and difficulties in the broader implementation of Resolution 2231. We reorganize the withdrawal of United States from the JCPOA presents a serious challenge. The commitment of the remaining participating countries is critical for the full implementation of the JCPOA. We hope they will continue to exert every possible effort in addressing the prevailing challenges and contribute to the full implementation of this agreement, which still remains vital for the global non-proliferation architecture. In addressing the proliferation risk posed by non-state actors, we believe the 1540 Committee continues to have a significant role, strengthening the assistance framework of this committee to member states aimed to addressing the implementation gaps continue to be important in comprehensively addressing the proliferation risk posed by non-state actors, including terrorists. Furthermore, strengthening the collaboration between the 1540 Committee Group of experts and members of the Analytical Support and Sanction Monitoring Team established pursuant to Security Council Resolution 5026 and 2253 concerning Daesh, Al-Qaeda and Taliban and associated individuals and entities requires attention from the Council. Finally, Mr. President, multilateral agreements such as the Biological Weapon Convention, the Chemical Weapon Convention, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty continues to eminently contribute to the prevention and elimination of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. At the time of great proliferation risk, it is in the best interest of all of us to preserve these important multilateral agreements to guarantee our collective safety and security and ensure their full and effective implementation. Let me therefore conclude my remark by reaffirming Ethiopia's unwavering commitment to continue fulfilling its international obligation by taking all the necessary measures to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery into the hands of state and non-state actors, including terrorists, as well as by fully implementing the relevant Security Council resolution in this regard. I thank you.
I thank the Minister for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Madam President. Excellencies, we are grateful to the U.S. Presidency for organizing today's summit meeting of world leaders focused on countering the spread and use of WMD. When previous distinguished speakers mentioned devastating consequences of the use and testing of weapons of mass destruction, I wish this audience and the world to understand that Kazakhstan, along with some other nations and vast territories, have been suffering from them since early days of the Cold War. And this goal is very close to Kazakhstan's heart and is one of the key priorities of my country's foreign policy. Kazakhstan's firm and unwavering commitment to international peace and security commenced upon our independence in 1991. The Semipalatinsk nuclear weapons test site, the fourth and second largest in the world, respectively. The international community acknowledged these actions as unprecedented and laudable by instituting the very date of the closure of the Semipalatinsk test site, namely 29th of August, as the International Day Against Nuclear Tests. This year, in September, the UN community commemorated the day in a new official high-level format at which the international community reinforced its plea for more effective steps to rebuild trust between nuclear and non-nuclear countries. Earlier this year in January, the signature event of Kazakhstan's presidency of the Security Council was devoted to the importance of confidence-building measures in achieving non-proliferation of WMD. CBMs succeeded in stopping the arms race and preventing a nuclear catastrophe in the past century. Today, the world expects from the nuclear powers a repeat of the same visionary actions, which unfortunately not being fully realized and acknowledged today. President Nazarbayev at the January's meeting, as well as in his manifesto, The World 21st Century, noted that the largest nuclear powers should be at the vanguard in the advocacy for a nuclear weapon-free world and lead by example in reducing the WMD. Past conflicts have showed that we cannot ensure our own security by undermining the security of others. President Nazarbayev has therefore urged all that only the complete elimination of nuclear weapons and disarmament would be the absolute guarantee against the use of or threat of use of nuclear weapons. He thus called upon all UN member states to build a nuclear weapon-free world by 2045 centenary of the United Nations. Madam President, we see some good examples of CBMs as as in the case of inter-Korean rapprochement and the Singapore summit, due to also very successful personal efforts of President Trump. This can inspire other positive outcomes of goodwill and sincere collaboration. Kazakhstan fully supports such promising beginnings and is ready to share its practical experience and expertise, if necessary, based on above-mentioned our sad legacy. However, just trust by itself cannot guarantee sustained success unless supported by strict implementation of all existing regulatory legal instruments and Security Council resolutions on sanctions. Without diminishing the role of NPT, it is clear that the world needs a stronger international legal framework against WMDs. Presently, the non-asymmetric implementation of the treaty is impeding the trust between nuclear and non-nuclear countries. Nevertheless, the NPT should not lose its effectiveness and relevance amid such skepticism. The early entry into force of CTBT should also become one of the most important and necessary building blocks of the global architecture of non-proliferation. And this treaty, when fully operative, will definitely help foster mutual trust and confidence. Kazakhstan actively cooperates with the CTBTO and annually conducts high-level international events aimed at implementing effective practical steps to achieve a world without nuclear threats as the natural outcome of our commitments. To realize this goal, we must first and foremost establish a final ban on nuclear testing. Secondly, atoms for peace should remain our important moral compass. However, in the meantime, we should not stop struggling for legal ban of nuclear weapons, keeping in mind our paramount goal of accomplishing a nuclear weapon-free world. By opening the IAEA Low-Enriched Uranium Bank last year, Kazakhstan made another contribution towards strengthening the non-proliferation regime, as well as safe and reliable use of uranium for peaceful purposes. We are grateful to all donors, the United States, the European Union, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Norway, and the Nuclear Threat Initiative, whose generous financial contributions have made this project possible. We also thank China and Russia for their cooperation regarding transit of low-enriched uranium and equipment for the bank through their territories. Madam President, how can we enforce non-proliferation and disarmament through the measures of the Security Council? Firstly, the Council must maintain its unity and common understanding to give the world a clear and unambiguous signal of our strong stance on these issues. It is vital to create the conviction among all that sanctions are interim measures and not an end in themselves. Their effectiveness should be measured by the degree of progress towards reaching political solutions peacefully. My President had also suggested withdrawal from the NPT should be made extremely difficult by possibly crafting a special UN Security Council resolution with serious implications for countries in breach of the treaty. President Nazarbayev also proposed developing a legally binding system of guarantees to be given by nuclear powers to those states who would voluntarily renounce their nuclear weapons, as well as those with non-nuclear status, as an incentive for their latter not to acquire such weapons. This is a fair step to be undertaken without significant expenditures. Nuclear weapons-free zones remain one of the effective measures to combat the spread of nuclear weapons. Thus, my President had proposed strengthening cooperation between nuclear weapons-free zones by organizing a high-level inter-zone meeting in Astana next year. P5 countries should encourage the expansion of such zones by providing them security guarantees. We therefore hope that the Central Asian nuclear weapons-free zone will be endorsed by the last remaining P5 country. Given the criticism of a considerably weakened non-proliferation regime in Syria, Kazakhstan is firmly convinced that the Council has to be united in tirelessly seeking a comprehensive solution on this issue of arbitration and prosecution without transferring such prerogatives to other structures, subjecting them to further polarization and politicization. The political resolution of the Syrian conflict will also help eliminate the vacuum that allows chemical weapons to be used with impunity. For our part, Kazakhstan will continue to provide the Astana platform of ceasefire and confidence-building measures as a complement and support to the Geneva process under the leadership of the United Nations. Regarding the JCPOA, this multilateral document has fulfilled its primary mission by putting Iran on a nuclear-free path, with the IAEA confirming that Iran has fulfilled all its nuclear obligations. Kazakhstan, with its reputation as an honest broker, hosted 2 sets of talks during the negotiations that led up to agreement. As the world's top uranium exporter, Kazakhstan contributed significantly by supplying 60 tons of raw uranium to Iran in exchange for Tehran sending over 300 kilograms of highly enriched uranium to Russia. All the parties to the agreement had acknowledged these measures as significant milestone, with this action constituting the first start of JCPOA's implementation. Notwithstanding the certain complications related to the obligations by some parties to the agreement, we hope for its further implementation. We propose to consider new concerns and challenges through all possible means of diplomacy without destroying the previous hard-won achievements. Finally, Madam President, it is necessary for our role in this Council to demonstrate responsibility, political will and wisdom to make a quantum leap towards of great historic significance. We need the moral compass to go from narrow national interests to a greater vision of a safe and secure world. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Minister for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden.
Thank you, Madam President. From listening to all countries around this table, I heard support for the idea that multilateral and diplomatic efforts are urgently needed to address the challenges of today. International peace and security and preventing conflict and terrorism are rightly highest on our agenda. I therefore thank you, Madam President, for convening this important meeting on non-proliferation. So, Madam President, we were asked to comment on 4 themes in this briefing: sanctions efficiency, capacity to implement, non-state actors, and weapons of mass destruction. And I think that the answer to all of these questions is close multilateral cooperation. The world would certainly be a much more dangerous place without the existing treaties and agreements of the global disarmament and non-proliferation regime. Yet that multilateral framework depends on our continuous commitment to collective solutions. In many parts of the world, we see modernization of nuclear weapons arsenals, increased missile capacities, the threat of chemical weapons use, and a normalization in the rhetoric surrounding all weapons of mass destruction. And history has shown us too many times that such steps forms a pathway to catastrophe. The nuclear weapon states bear a particular responsibility in upholding and making good on the commitment inherent in the NPT of a nuclear weapons-free world. And to this end, the review conference in 2020 must pave the way for enhanced disarmament and non-proliferation commitments. Equally, Sweden reiterates the call on all states to sign and ratify the CTBT. Madam President, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is the common tool towards disarmament and non-proliferation, but let me today also focus on 3 specific issues, and many of you have already touched upon them. The challenges, of course, to the Iran nuclear agreement, the DPRK's development of nuclear weapons, and the recurring use of chemical weapons. So first, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal, is a historic achievement. It's a concrete example of effective diplomatic non-proliferation efforts. And this agreement prevents nuclear proliferation in Iran, but also aims to avoid ripple effects in the region. As the IAEA confirms, Iran continues to fulfill its nuclear obligations under the agreement. And as long as this is the case, the JCPOA effectively curtails Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons. This is why Sweden, together with the rest of the European Union, deeply regrets the United States' unilateral withdrawal from the agreement, a decision with far-reaching consequences that makes our world more unsafe. And frankly, what are the alternatives to this agreement? Undercutting a concrete multilateral non-proliferation tool dangerously undermines our joint non-proliferation efforts elsewhere. Together with our EU partners, we will try to mitigate the adverse effects of the US policies. Sweden and the rest of the EU will continue to foster broad relations and dialogue with Iran, including on issues such as human rights. Iran's role in the region and missile activities are clearly a matter of concern. And these concerns can and should, however, be addressed separately and not at the expense of the JCPOA. Security in the Middle East region can only be achieved through diplomatic solutions and enhanced cooperation, not through further polarization and isolation. And remember, we've tried that before, for decades, isolation and sanctions. And all it did was to support the most conservative forces in Iran. That's a problem. Secondly, the DPRK's nuclear weapons program is a major threat to the global non-proliferation regime. Recent diplomatic efforts deserve our full and active support, and the continued progress in the inter-Korean dialogue is very encouraging. And the summit between the United States and the DPRK in Singapore in June was indeed significant. All parties must now work to maintain momentum and take positive steps. For the DPRK, this means the commitments must be translated into legally binding undertakings, and the IAEA should be given a role early in the verification of the denuclearization and disarmament process. The Security Council and the international community must continue to stand united. Thirdly, the use of chemical weapons is a serious violation of international law, and every violation undermines established norms and risks eroding the international taboo on these weapons. And this is a very serious and worrisome development. The use of chemical weapons is morally abhorrent and can never be accepted. In Syria, the OPCW, UN Joint Investigative Mechanism, has confirmed that chemical weapons were used repeatedly by the Syrian Arab Republic and by Daesh. We supported the decision to task the OPCW to identify the perpetrators of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And while a mechanism established by this Council would have been preferable, the issue was too important to be allowed to be blocked. And this does, however, not free this Council from its responsibility to ensure that those responsible are held to account. In Salisbury, a targeted murder was attempted using a nerve agent, and such assaults are absolutely unacceptable, and we call on Russia to fully cooperate with the investigations. Madam President, we must never lose sight of why we are making the efforts to eliminate those horrific weapons. Until now, we have not talked about the victims. And I have myself met with survivors of nuclear weapons attacks, and I will never forget their stories. Victims of chemical weapons have shared similar accounts, and it is important to listen to such personal experiences to understand what it is that we are fighting for. It has definitely strengthened my resolve to step up efforts for non-proliferation and disarmament. Weapons of mass destruction is clearly a global threat that we must address together, and only through multilateral solutions, including by this Council, can we effectively prevent the use of these repugnant weapons. The multilateral non-proliferation and disarmament framework is also a key pillar of the international rules-based order. We owe this to the survivors and victims of past attacks, and we owe it to future generations. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the Minister for her statement. Thank you all for joining us here today. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers, and this meeting is adjourned.